Hello, everybody, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview interesting, smart people about how your presentation skills, you can use your presentation skills to show up and affect the way people perceive you and to move people to take action. A lot of what we do is the thinking behind the presentation skills. So that's the fun of what I get to do today, is I get to talk to Rebecca Costa about change and adapting to change, because anybody who's going to be a thought leader and speaker out there in the world is going to have to address change. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to check out our free assessment. If you're curious about how your presentation skills are going, you can go to speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And there in 4 minutes, you can see how you are strong in your presentation skills and where maybe you'd like to use, get a little bit of extra support. So Rebecca Costa, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I'm delighted to have you here. I'm so happy that I actually got found on the internet. Your assistant found me and I said, wow, me? She wants to talk to me? Yes, I want to talk to her. You're the sort of person that I listen to on podcasts all the time. So yippee, it's cool that I get to have you here. Let me give you the short version of the official bio, because the main official bio is long and very impressive. But Rebecca Costa is an American sociobiologist and futurist. She's the preeminent global expert on the subject of fast adaptation, which is really what I want to talk to you about today. She's the recipient of the prestigious Edward O. Wilson Biodiversity Technology Award. Her career spans 4 decades of working with founders, key executives, and venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Rebecca's first book, The Watchman's Rattle, is a radical new theory of collapse, was an international bestseller. Her follow-on book, titled On the Verge, was introduced in 2017 to critical acclaim, shooting to the top of Amazon's #1 new business releases. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, San Francisco Chronicle, The Guardian, and many, many other leading publications. So Rebecca, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you read the short bio, because the long bio really makes me feel old.
Right. Well, you know, well, hopefully over the years we amass we amass lots of good tools. So that's the intention. One of the things I wanted to ask you before we get on to sociobiology and change and adaptation is, who is your dream interview? If you were to share the stage with someone from history, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and one I wasn't really prepared to answer. But let me say this: I have no problem finding heroes in the past. I have more of a difficulty finding heroes and role models today, and that probably is going to speak to a lot about what we're going to talk about. But if I were,
you know what, I'm going to pause you here and pause this. So Rebecca, I'm thrilled to have you here. I have all sorts of questions to ask you. But first, let me ask you something not about current events, which is, if you had a dream interview, if you could interview someone from history, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It's interesting that you're opening with that. I don't have any trouble looking for role models and heroes in past history. I'm glad you didn't ask me about finding somebody that was my dream interview today. Because I have more trouble finding role models and heroes today. But I guess if I were to select one person from history, it would be Richard Feynman, the great physicist who found himself working on the first atomic bomb. And that might seem like a curious person to start with, but in my world, Richard Feynman was a good balance between a person who was deeply ingrained in the fundamentals of science, and was science driven, but he had a very rich personal life and a very eclectic life. And he knew that the more eclectic his personal life was, the more his brain would think creatively about problems. And so he learned about music. He played the bongo drums, and he actually wrote a ballet that was all based on percussion instruments. And he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was sort of a cultural hub between Native American culture and American and traditional American pilgrim kind of culture brought from Europe. And he had a weekly lunch with an artist where he would explain why a flower had a beautiful pink or red color in scientific terms, and the artist would explain why that isn't important and that isn't the purpose of the flower. and they would have these long philosophical dialogues. And I think that in order to be truly successful in life and also in your career, you need that input from many, many sources, because you don't know how it's going to crop up later on. You don't know how it's going to be useful to you. And very often in my work, I consult presently with the largest global corporations in the world. Many times in my work, I'm bringing in a historical example or an artistic example or a musical example to help people understand the complexity that they might be dealing with. The examples outside of themselves are sometimes easier to grasp and bring in, and even sometimes the terminology.
I love that. One of the things I do as training speakers a lot is talking to them about how to use stories and metaphors to help people understand that. So if you have a hard time understanding why you should hire them to install your computer system, you can say it's because the computer system's like a Swiss Army knife, and then go from there. So that kind of thing. So this is fascinating. What would you ask him, Richard Feynman?
I would probably ask him what he thought his greatest accomplishment was, because I don't think it was his participation in the atomic bomb, although that is what he is known for. Mm-hmm. I think I would get a very, very balanced and philosophical answer. It might be something like choosing to move to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and take the job with Los Alamos Labs because his wife was suffering from a respiratory illness that they thought the dry air would might help her. She passed away, but I think I would get a very, very different answer, a very humane answer. And that's the thing that I think scientists many times get marginalized. They get marginalized as not believing in God. If you believe in science, you must not believe in God. If you're an evolutionary biologist, you certainly can't possibly, be a person of faith. Scientists are portrayed as cold or maniacal or, or practically autistic sometimes. I mean, and yet the most brilliant scientists in the world have these very rich personal lives and rich spiritual beliefs. And so I think that if we could correct that perception, that would be interesting.
I have scientists in my family, and I've had scientists for many years. Having grown up in the arts, there always was this sort of, science, they have no soul. But every scientist I know has some sort of artistic outlet. My brother-in-law is a scientist and sang in a choir for years and years and years. It was that sort of thing. It's just the love of music or art or something. And that's really where artists can have blinders and say, no, no, we are the only ones who can think about this sort of thing. That was pointed out to me in my 20s as how arrogant I was being. And of course I was 24, so I was pretty arrogant anyway, but I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten.
Well, I think when a scientist looks at music or we look at art, you know, we approach it very differently. We're looking for pattern, you know, and we're looking for things that we can identify, quantify, measure, repeat. We're looking for things differently. And so this is why dialogues between Feynman, you know, and many of them he recorded in a diary, these dialogues that went on between he and his artistic friend once a week were just fascinating. You know, they're fascinating conversations because they're about, think about this, they're about a flower and the color in the flower or the beauty of nature, and yet they're approached very, very differently. And according to Feynman, both benefited from having the information that the other had. So again, you know, you might have some eclectic hobbies like singing in a choir, or you might learn to play the guitar, and you might not see the relevance to the way in which you're going to solve difficult or complex problems. But you can't, your imagination requires content. You know, you're not going to solve a physics problem if you've never taken a course in physics, you know, and you're not going to solve a medical problem if you're not trained in medicine. So the more content you have, the more resources your brain has to draw on. And this is really important. So even though you might not think a walk in nature is giving you any content, you might notice a bug, you might follow that bug to an anthill, you might spend some time looking at how social insects work on that anthill. That might give you an idea about your own leadership in your own group. You know, this is how the imagination stretches. Our brains are phenomenal organs, and to that extent, I'm most interested in people who have a richness, not only in their professional life, but in their personal life.
Well, and exactly. And some, you know, they always say your best ideas come in the shower, but it's because you're not yet, you know, your hands are busy with something else, something repetitive, and it leaves your mind free to roam.
I always wondered if that was the hot water hitting my head.
Could be that too, you know. With one of the things we don't think about is, you know, the whole tactile sensation of water hitting your head. And it is one of the things that it's hard nowadays to remove ourselves from distractions. So for instance, if you're in the shower, you're not listening to the news. You're not, so if you're listening to something that has content, part of your brain is busy at the content, and then it shuts off some of the imagination aspects.
Well, it's also a reason that I solve a lot of problems in my car.
Yep, absolutely.
Because I'm alone, no one else is going to get in the car, and I've got 15 minutes or a half an hour or a 1 hour drive. I love to drive, and I'm smart. I have a piece of paper, a little notepad, and a pen there, and I just write a couple of key words to remind myself so I can get back. Because I find that once that thinking period is over, I can't always get. I knew I had an answer, but it was so hard to access.
I often wonder if going for a walk, listening to podcasts is shutting off my access to the ideas I'm trying to think about.
Well, I think, you know, there is a relationship between quiet time and your brain's permission to roam, you know, and you do come up with some pretty interesting ideas. For me, there's a time frame. It's very early in the morning. By the way, this is very inconvenient because I find that between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., I do my best writing and my best thinking. I can force myself to write and think through problems after 6 a.m., but the quality is never as good.
Right.
And that's, you know, that's probably many years from now, they'll find it's a biorhythmic thing. It has something to do with, you know, my cycles. But and so when I'm working on a particularly difficult problem, I have to set my alarm at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and not only don't I like it, my dog hates it. You know?
I do too. And then, and the cats are happy. So, you know, this, oh, someone's up to pay attention to us. And then if I'm trying to sleep past 4:30, the cat's outside going, oh,
What happened?
wait a minute. Yeah. Wait, why aren't we playing?
What
Yeah.
happened here? We're off schedule.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just think loading content, finding some quiet time. You're right. Distractions are not good. You know, they're probably, you know, some people get their best ideas when they're washing dishes, some in the shower, some when they're taking a walk, some when they're driving. You kind of know these things about yourself. And I think it's always good to like take an assessment and say, when do I have my best ideas?
Mm-hmm.
You know, for me, it is in the shower and it's driving. So sometimes when I'm really struggling with something, and I'm going to take a lot of heat for this because of the carbon footprint that I'm creating, you know, willingly. I will get in my car and I will drive. I will drive somewhere where I need to, you know, I might not go to the closest store to me. I might go to a further store because I need that time. There's something about driving my car that, you know, stimulates the ideas. Or I might take another shower in the middle of the afternoon if I need that stimulation. I think it's okay to be honest with yourself about the strange things that lead you to be able to solve difficult problems.
This actually leads me to one of my basic questions. For those of us who aren't in your world, you call yourself a sociobiologist. And bearing in mind, we have a lot of international listeners, so for whom English is not their first language. Can you, part of what you were talking about sounds like maybe what you mean by sociobiology, but I'm just guessing. Can you define that for us, please?
Well, sociobiology, by the way, even if English is your first language, 99% of the population doesn't know what a sociobiologist is. So
I was just giving them an excuse.
Yes. So I don't think it would matter if English was your first language. A sociobiologist looks at how societies behave from a genetic and evolutionary perspective. So one way to think about it is we have some evolutionary programming in this biological spacesuit, and it has an influence on how societies form themselves and how they behave and how the individuals in that society behave. And we've gotten very far away from that. We act like there's no biological programming, that everything is based on free will and free decision. But time and time again, scientists run experiments and people act in ways that are not rational. And typically when societies and individuals act in irrational ways, there's an evolutionary explanation for why that instinct or why that behavior persisted. It was to our survival advantage at one point, and yet the society has moved forward to a point where it may no longer be in our interest to behave in that particular way.
You know, this actually touches on a lot of things that I think about all the time about the evolutionary and genetic basis on how we communicate, and why you have single-focused communicators and multi-focused communicators, often known as the masculine mode and the feminine mode. Although I do believe we can all adapt both. I mean, plenty of times I'm in masculine mode or feminine mode. Is that the sort of thing that might be a socio-biological answer to that? Or description?
Yes, it could be. Let me explain. Most people are not biologists that are listening to the program, but if we were to cut the skulls open of a male and a female and pull their brains out, and assuming they were the same size, we would immediately be able to identify the female brain and which was the male brain. Really? They are not the same. I think people are going around saying that the brain is exactly the same in a woman as a man. No, they didn't evolve similarly, and they're not similar. And the speech centers and the communication centers of the brain are much larger in women than they are in men. They're overdeveloped. The areas that require better spatial understanding of objects and that kind of thing is more developed in males. The corpus callosum, which connects the left and the right hemisphere of the brain, is about 30% larger in women. So just that cord, that cable, and many people believe, neuroscientists believe that explains a women's intuition, where both sides of your brain are firing at exactly the same point in time. So we have to understand that our brains are physiologically not the same. So there is a physiological explanation why men are not as communicative typically as women are, and particularly about feelings and emotions and all of that. So you could think about it as a physiological handicap. That's the way I handle, lack of communication. I go, oh, well, if you were blind, would I be mad at you? No, and you might as well be, because you don't have the communication facilities, biological facilities that I have. So we have to understand that a lot of the differences between men and female are physiologically based. That said, you can compensate for that.
Right.
Since I know that my logic centers are not as well developed as males, and my ability to judge spatial distances is not as well. As a scientist, I had to compensate for that. And I said, well, I've got a physiological handicap, so I got to work harder in mathematics, and I got to work harder in physics, and I was compensatory in that way. But it's important to understand the physiology. Now, there's a reason women's communication skills, probably became superior, and that is because women have a long gestation period of giving birth. 9 months amongst mammals is very, very long. And so they were typically sheltered in caves or in safe locations, while the men went out and became the hunters. The women became the gatherers. And we know this from human history. So the men had to really judge the distance and the speed at which predators were coming at them. And they had to remain quiet for long periods of time as they group hunted. Women, on the other hand, became very social. They stayed in very small areas, and they jointly raised children together. And so their communication centers, we believe, grew out of that. Their language skills were better. Their interdependence was better. And so we believe that really was the differential, and that has persisted today. So when you see people going into marriage counseling and they say, well, he never, communicates my feelings and so on and so forth. I always have a smile on my face when I'm watching these reality shows, and I'm thinking, there is a biological explanation, but it probably won't make it onto TV.
Listening to you say this, this sort of thing is a huge part of my work with clients, because a lot of what I do is helping women speak to men and get men to listen to them. However, as you were saying all of this, there are so many value judgments popping up in the back of my mind. I was just biting my tongue to say, well, is that good? Is that bad? Is that wrong? Is it women downgrading men for not communicating, or is it men? Because, if the woman says he never talks about his feelings, the man might say she never gets to the point. I had a whole choir going.
But as a scientist, I have a different lane. I've chosen a different lane than you. And I think the lane you're in, and the reason I'm on your program, is important. It's an important one, because we have to work together, right? And we have to solve problems together, and we have to defend against threats together. And so there has to be a way that men listen to women, women listen to men. That's very, very important. But as a scientist, I don't have a value judgment. It's neither good nor bad, it just is. Uh-huh. And in today's world, we're very quick to say, well, you're saying something bad about women, or you're saying something good about men, or bad about men. I am neither. I am simply stating fact. And I noticed that today we have to put this extra layer on the fact. It's a good fact or a bad fact. Well, no, it's just a fact. It has no value whatsoever. So this is why I always start with, well, if we had two brains of equal size, you know, even an amateur biologist would be able to say female, male, instantly. And we are not physiologically the same. We are not designed to behave the same or think the same. That doesn't mean we're not equal.
Okay.
That does not mean we're not equal, and it doesn't mean that you can't compensate for whatever shortfall. But you're not going to compensate for a shortfall you don't know you have.
Right. Or even just a shortfall, just an adaptation, that just ways to adapt to function in the world that is run by one system or another. I'm trying to think of a non-value judgment way to say this.
Let me talk about something that is in your lane and I think is really, really important, right? Because you want women to be heard and you want women to be part of the process, not because people think they should include women, but because they bring value. That's why. That's the only reason why.
Yeah.
So the thing for me was when I started out in Silicon Valley, I started out in the late 70s and early 80s, there were no women.
Yeah.
Period. Engineering was a male profession, and any room that I went into as an executive, I was the only woman there.
Tell us quickly what you were the executive of.
I worked for a couple of computing firms. One was bought by General Electric, one by United Telecom, and then I worked for General Electric for a period of time until I went to a startup incubation company, and then I formed my own company in Silicon Valley and sold it. So that's the short version that doesn't make me feel old.
Okay.
So
experience, let's put it that way.
Yes. So the interesting thing that I discovered very quickly was that no one was listening to me. And I was very frustrated, and my father happened to live on the way to my house. And so I would always stop by and talk to him, and he was a great sounding board for me. And I would tell him how frustrated I was. I'd say, look, I keep telling them we have to do this, and here's the budget. And they say, go back and study it again. And I'm in this endless loop of making a case when the other guys don't have to do this. Why do I have to keep studying it and bringing more data and everything? And, you know, other guys get stuff through and all of that. And he listened to me, you know, and he said, well, I'm gonna tell you something that you don't want to hear. And he said, you're gonna have to be better than those guys. And my first words out of my mouth were, that's not fair.
Yes.
And he said, when you're better than them, you can deal with fair.
Good point.
He said, you've got it backwards. You want fair first. He said, get the power first, and then you can work on fair.
Yeah.
And it really stuck with me. I was stuck on it's not fair. So what I realized very quickly on, and by the way, this it doesn't just happen to apply to sexual discrimination, but also to racial discrimination or cultural discrimination or you know, sexual preference discrimination. If a company needs you so badly, they can't afford to discriminate. You have to make yourself so valuable that they have to forget you're a woman, or that you're Black, or that you're Hispanic, or that you're a dwarf, or that, you know, or that you are missing an eye, or that you're bald, or, you know, that you're obese. They have to forget that because they need the skill you have so desperately. In other words, you have to put the company in a bit of a fear state that they could lose you if they don't take care of that. And when you think about it, and I'm going to go back to our evolutionary history. Anytime you see a movie where a meteor is going to hit the Earth or space aliens are going to attack us, why do we like those movies so much? We like them because suddenly all the countries in the world come together and collaborate to defend against the common enemy, right?
Right.
And that is in our DNA. The reason we are social troop-dwelling organisms, and that the human organism has climbed to the top of the living pyramid, is because when a predator or a threat or a danger came our way that was greater than any individual could fend off, we came together as a group and fended off that threat and that danger. This is in our DNA. And so when we need each other, we're really quick to come together. And this is really the key to overcoming any of the isms. And this is what I did. I decided my dad was right. I pushed fair aside, and I decided I would become so valuable to the company, they couldn't afford to discriminate against me. And I made myself better than the men. And when I got that power, I started hiring and mentoring women. I worked on fair immediately.
Yeah. That's wonderful. That's amazing. The history of all of that. One of the things that this brings up is change. And how do we change? How do we adapt? Which is it's actually what I was starting to ask you about, but we've gone off in all these really interesting directions. So it's the joy of live conversation is how can organizations adapt? And I've just been putting in there, I have thought for years in watching society, and I think a lot about historical cycles and how things evolve. People don't change unless they have to, unless the alternative is worse. Otherwise, who would ever go on a diet, Why would I ever stop eating chocolate chip cookies unless I was trying to still fit into my pants? So how can an organization be able to adapt to change? I mean, we're recording this in 2020. We're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic is still raging. The world is changing. How can we adapt?
You have to, if you think about it, we have a lot of tools today that we didn't have before. One of the areas that I specialize in is predictive analytics. That's basically taking billions and billions and billions of data points and looking at how they trend and then being able to anticipate what the next action is going to be. The more data you have, the higher your percentage of prediction is going to be accurate. And we are amassing so much data right now that we're entering a period where we know what comes next, right? So you can't say that we didn't know a virus like this could spread and shut everything down. We've had knowledge of this for many, many decades. Scientists have, right? What is unfortunate is the human body is only designed to react to short-term threat. This is why we're not doing anything about climate change. We didn't do anything about the virus when we could have. We're not doing anything about the government deficit. Try to talk to a 20-year-old about saving for retirement or buying life insurance. Their eyes roll up in the back of their head. That's because if you think about it, if I take a snake and throw it down in front of you, your body, you bypass any thinking, your body immediately floods with chemicals, then you go into fight or flight, which are both actions. But if I start talking to you about things that are 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, your heartbeat doesn't even go up 1 beat an hour. Nothing happens to you physiologically. You're not designed to spring into action. It's very unnatural to try to act on something that's 20 years out. Again, this is the human biology entering into how we behave and how, as a society, we address problems. So unless I can make that problem immediate and get your juices going and get you to take action, nothing happens. And we see this in a lot of long-term problems. When you talk to me about adaptation, I believe that because we have the tools to see what's going to happen, right? We see robotics are going to happen. We see 3D printing happening. We see nanotechnology. We see, 5G and machine-to-machine communication, right? We see the jobs that are going to be lost and be gone because they will no longer be necessary. We know what these things are. Don't put your head in the sand. Get ready for what's coming, and you know it's coming. It's not going to come. And so my biggest problem with people is that they want to adapt on the fly. Well, when it comes, I'll adapt. Well, you know what? That doesn't work. It doesn't work in nature, which is the greatest empirical example that we have. You have to start to make the turn like an ocean liner. You want to make the turn, you got to start at miles and miles ahead. You know, you're not a speedboat, you're an ocean liner, and you need to prepare yourself for what's coming. So what I talk about is pre-adaptation. And in my book, On the Verge, if you don't mind me making a plug, I list out 12 principles of pre-adaptation that allow you to start adapting before the environment changes, before the disruptive event occurs. You have to prepare yourself in advance because those are the survivors, and we know what those principles are.
So how do we get ourselves to do that?
Well, you know, we don't, you know, biologically, I'm asking you to go against your biology that says I'll change when I have to.
Right.
Right. Because it doesn't work. You won't be one of the survivors. And by the way, there is no opportunity to thrive in the middle of a crisis. Believe me, some companies right now are making more money than they've ever made in the history of their company in the middle of COVID.
Right. Right.
Right. So you want to be one of those where when disruption and change occurs, you as an individual and your company can thrive in the face of change, not be devastated by it.
So how do we get ourselves to do it? If it's, I mean just like a short-term thing is always a challenge for me. I have a coach who's helping me train myself to work on the long-term projects instead of answering emails and spending the first 3 hours of the morning answering emails, rather than dealing with something which I know is coming, but it's not imminent yet. So if it's not a deadline, I'm not going to work on it. How can we, I don't know, manufacture a crisis? So we have to set up accountability, set up deadlines. How do we, if we know this is a tendency, what can we do about it?
Yeah, there's always compensatory behaviors. I'm a big believer in compensatory behaviors.
How do we compensate then?
Okay, well, I'll give an example, a simple example, and then I'll go to your example of procrastinating until the deadline is on you. And a lot of college students, if they're listening right now, they can relate to this because they'll work on their term paper. They have all quarter to work on it, and they'll work on it 2 days before it's due, right?
Yes.
And they'll stress themselves out. By the way, it's not good for you physiologically to operate in that way. I used to always run late, you know, by 5 or 10 minutes, and I knew it was wrong, and I just didn't understand why I couldn't manage my time better. So I took all my clocks and I set them 5 and 10 minutes ahead. And I forgot about it. I'm a dunce. Every time I look at my clock in my house, I think it's correct. I even did that on my cell phone. It took me a long time to add minutes because your cell phone doesn't want to do that. But every time I look at anything, I've forgotten that I have an extra 5 or 10 minutes. I'm easily, one good thing about me is I'm easily fooled.
Okay.
and I made that discovery. So now I arrive on time or slightly early. So if you're a procrastinator, right, then it means that you're externally driven. You're externally driven by a deadline. You're not internally driven. And in a case like that is just to make an acknowledgement and find somebody who you need to give that paper to proofread for you, and back that, and they need time. And then back that up and say, all right, I need someone to look at my outline and see if my outline is a good, is a narrative they can follow, and back that deadline up. In other words, the big deadline is the problem. Lots of small deadlines that involve other people.
Mm-hmm.
Not you, because you're not internally driven. If you have something, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and because I'm a sociobiologist, and sometimes people confuse that with being a psychic, because I can get in, I know the patterns to look for. I would say about you, if you have something you have to deliver to another person, or they are counting on you, you never fail.
Yeah, no, I learned that about myself years ago.
Yeah.
I learned that years ago, is I had to set up deadlines for myself, and then I would tell my assistants,
you are
bug
going
me
to
early.
you're going to deliver no matter what, if it's another person.
Yeah.
But if it's yourself, you may cut yourself slack. Oh, I don't really have to get, I'll do it next week, blah, 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 blah. You don't hold the deadline to yourself at the same standard as you hold the deadline and the obligation to someone else.
So is there a sociobiological reason for this? Maybe I can stop beating myself up and just saying this is the way I'm built.
I don't know. I have to think about it. I didn't know the conversation was going to go in this direction.
I didn't either.
I don't know, but I'll think about it. There probably is, but I don't know right off the top of my head what that would be.
Okay, Rebecca, this is amazing. I do actually had some questions for you. So I want to see if I make sure I've got the. Let's take it out of the personal and me procrastinating, because that's just a lifelong challenge. How about institutions? So, many of the people I work within institutions, corporations, et cetera. I have run a company. You've run a company or two or three. How can we help institutions, corporations, companies, I guess, recognize the resistance to change and be willing to adapt? It's a big question, I know.
We have to educate them and help the company understand why it's been successful. So companies are Pavlovian, right? Mm-hmm. They're started by a founder, and that founder's values become the culture of the corporation.
And just for a moment, just say Pavlovian, as in Pavlov's dog that's trained to salivate.
You ring the bell, you give the dog food, you ring the bell, you give the dog food. Eventually you ring the bell and the dog salivates even without the food.
Right. Okay, thank you.
So when I talk about Pavlov's dogs, I talk about corporations being rather Pavlovian. So you start out with your founder's values. If it's Steve Jobs, his values became Apple Computer's culture. Sam Walton, his values became Walmart's culture. So culture emanates from the founder, and it never changes, right? Mm-hmm. So as that company becomes more and more successful, right, it becomes institutionally entrenched. Why? Because it's rewarded for doing and acting in a particular way.
Right.
And it keeps getting rewarded. So it gets larger and larger and larger. Mm-hmm. So now you come along and you say, we got to change. People are not going for superstores anymore. They want to buy online, right? Mm-hmm. And there's only so much Walmart can do. They saw Amazon coming. Mm-hmm. Walmart could have become Amazon, but they couldn't change that much. And the reason is because they've been rewarded for superstores for so long that the most that they could do is they were able to do curbside delivery. Mm-hmm. You can walk the bags to your car from the superstore.
Right.
We're not going to give up the superstores, right? So in the same way that Amazon now is trying to open up, is buying like the old JCPenney's and all of that, and is going to try to move into the storefront. It's going to be very hard for Amazon to do that, because that's not their culture, that's not their value, and that's not what they were reinforced for. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that it's very, very difficult for those companies to do. What is smart is to do what Boeing did, many, many decades ago, and that is to create skunk works that are at an arm's length distance from the mothership, where you let people that, let me give you an example, a very successful example of what Toyota did. Mm-hmm. Toyota was in the economy car business, and they wanted to get into the luxury car business, and they knew that the economy car business had too many obstacles to be able to get into luxury automobiles. And so what did they do? They created Lexus, a different brand, a different operation, different executives, right? Different culture. Lexus is a Toyota effectively, but it's run like a luxury car company. It's not run like an economic. So many times you've got to create a distance. If you know that a market is changing and you know that you have institutional resistance, you've got to create a Skunk Works or an arm's length or even a different brand and begin investing in that so that you can run in parallel for a period of time.
Well, thinking of Toyota, Toyota has a research institute that is working on, I mean, it is sort of a separate subset of the mothership, if you will.
You have an R&D facility that the mothership is not allowed to dictate.
Exactly. And they're working on self-driving cars, but they're also working on AI and robotics for the home, where people who are, say, as you're aging, you can use robotics to do some of the things that maybe the aging brain is forgetting to do so that people can still live independently. And that one took me a while. When I learned about that, I said, what does that have to do with cars? And they said, well, you know, it comes from, I guess it's the same sort of original category as the Urquell, if you will, of the self-driving cars.
Well, when you think about it, Toyota is forward-looking. They're basically saying there's a massive aging population, right, that wants to live independently. What can we do to extend the possibility of them living independently 3, 5, 10 years? And can we take this technology and adapt it? So again, what are they doing? They're pre-adapting. They're pre-adapting to where the market is going.
Yes, exactly.
This is what pre-adaptation is. They're not waiting until there are no more beds in assisted living. They're basically saying we can delay assisted living, you know, for a very long period of time by the use of technology.
That's great. That's so exciting. So from pre-adapting ourselves, clearly one should go and read your book. That's On the Verge, right? To helping institutions change. I've got one more question, which is, suppose you're in an institution and you can see the need for change, but there's resistance. You don't have a Toyota Research Institute. Are there ways one could start? Are there early steps that one can take to help a company adapt?
Yeah, I think so one of the clients that I have is a very large global corporation, and they're having a lot of trouble innovating when disruption comes along. And so what they asked us to do is to look for partners in the world that were doing really bleeding edge innovation. And once a year, to have a day where those partners are brought into the company and make executive and leadership presentations. So we have an innovation day, and it's really fun because we bring in 8 companies, each for an hour each, and one presents through lunch, and the top brass, right, from the president, the board, and and all the EVPs. They all get together and they sit and they watch these presentations from these corporations and from these scientists and universities of what's coming, right? With no obligation to do anything whatsoever, engage them or anything. And it really helps them to have a wake-up call, because people have to see, why do people go to trade shows? They go to, why do they roam all those aisles and look at all those booths? And they go to see how far along the technology and the development is, and is there something that they're missing? And it's really an inefficient way to do it. It's better to have things curated for your specific organization. So if you can find consultants like myself that will go out and say, you know, we got 180 scientists that scan the world, and we know what is going to affect your marketplace. And we're going to bring in 8 leaders who are on the cutting edge that you should engage, or, you know, or license, or develop some kind of, you know, preemptively get them working with your company. And we bring those in. And I have to tell you, not a single, we've done this 6 years in a row, and not a single executive will miss it.
Yeah, I believe it.
They love it. They love it. They get to touch and feel it, and they go, wow, this is really working. And, you know, this is crazy. And this was like, you know, 12 years ago, we were bringing drones in that were doing warehouse scanning, and we were bringing facial recognition software in, and we were, you know, we were bringing blockchain in, tied to their specific products. So again, you know, if you've got to pre-adapt, you've got to know what's coming. By the time you read about it, or someone in the industry tells you about it, you're way too late.
Oh gosh. Well, Rebecca, I think I'm going to have to check in with you about 6 months from now and see where we're going, because I want to have you back and say, okay, now what do we do? I'm definitely going to listen to this over and over and think about how we can do it, you know, certainly changing in my business, but also the people around you and so forth. And this has been fascinating. If you have one thought to leave us with, besides read your books, definitely read your books, is there one key nugget you can leave us with?
Change is constant. Disruption is constant. Right now it's COVID. Prior to this, it might have been 9/11, or it might have been, you know, the subprime mortgage collapse. You know, industries come and they go, careers come and go. But the one thing, the one skill that every corporation and every individual has to have is their resiliency and their adaptability. That is the one skill that remains constant. And to the extent that you acquire that skill and you master it, you will thrive when these disruptions occur. You won't be devastated by them and harmed. You'll thrive. You'll be able to opportunistically make that adjustment. That's
wonderful. Rebecca Costa, thank you so much for having been on Speakers Who Get Results. It's an absolute honor to have you here, and I'm very interested in learning more, following you, and I'm definitely gonna have to check in, and when we see what happens and adapting to the next bit of change, that will be great. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. Once again, if you're interested in your presentation skills, how they connect to leadership and adapting to change, and if you want to see where your presentation skills stand, take our free assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's speakforresultsquiz.com. And in only 4 minutes, you can see where you're rocking your presentation skills and where you might need a little bit of support. Rebecca Costa, thank you so much for having been on Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This has been Elizabeth Bachman, and I'll see you on the next one.